alleged actions. And I'm going to direct you to the paragraphs because this is extremely important. Most media that I've seen where you get in the United Kingdom presenters asking questions, they clearly have not been briefed, they clearly don't know what they're talking about, and they allow spokesmen for the Israeli authorities not only to get away with murder on the ground, get away with murder in their interviews, because they don't know, as I say, what the parameters are. Now, if you have the report in front of you, page 3, use of force, it's the 5th paragraph. I'm not going to read it out, but this is where I'm taking it from. What we've spelt out here, first of all, a very, very important precursor to all the discussion is that Israel is not defending itself against an attack allowed for under the United Nations Charter from another nation state. In which event, obviously, it is entitled to take action. However, if you're not fighting another state, and make this point, Israel itself says that it's not another state because they call the occupied territories or Gaza or both together hostile entities, unknown in the law, unknown as a concept, hostile entities. So even they're not saying they're dealing with a state. It's the same term that the Americans tend to use when they were dealing with Iraq, enemy competence, because that got them around the Vienna Conventions. In other words, there is a lot of speakeasy that's going on here, creating terms that don't exist. So, very important, they're not defending themselves at all. What they are doing is prolonging an illegal occupation. It is an occupation. They're there temporarily. Well, since 1967, if that's temporary, you know, I don't know what is. I mean, that's certainly not temporary, is it? So they are not entitled as an occupying force to use the kind of aggression that they are, and most particularly in the Gaza case, a continued blockade. In other words, Gaza doesn't have frontiers which it controls nothing. It certainly doesn't even have the facilities anyway, on the ground left. So it doesn't have a border it controls. It's not a state. They can barely sustain themselves. So we've spelt out there that what Israel is doing is, as I say, contrary to international law. So I'm not making this up. It's not, as I say, it's not a polemic from me. I have the authority of the law to back up what I'm saying. And there's no issue about this, but the Israelis and the Americans and others skirt around it, because it's very easy to say, well, there's a rocket fight, so we had the blanket bomb or whatever they're going to do. Anyway, that comes to another point. And what it also means, and we have inserted it in the report, is that those people who are occupied have a right to resist. And I don't think the very same people who are eulogizing the Israeli attacks would therefore deny the right of the French resistance to do what they did. So that is what they are. They're like the French resistance. They're entitled to resist an occupying force, particularly when the occupying force is using disproportionate, indiscriminate force. And that's where you get into the specific crime. So, therefore, paragraph 5 is the beginning of the answer. Now, paragraph 6 goes into why there are war crimes being committed, because they're not distinguishing between, I just give one or two criteria, they're not distinguishing between civilian and military targets, and they're using disproportionate force. Now there's an important bullet point over the page, on the next page. They're committing a war crime as an occupying force if they're intentionally launching attacks in the knowledge that such attacks would cause incidental, sometimes called collateral, euphemistically, loss of life. Now, tucked away in that paragraph is a very important doctrine that the Israelis employ. There's no question, they don't doubt it. It started in the Lebanon, the Dahia doctrine, which is essentially this, that if they suspect one rocket, they'll obliterate kilometres and miles of land and property and people around. In fact, it's intended, as somebody said earlier, to terrorise the civilian population altogether, to punish the civilian population altogether on a much wider scale. That's exactly what was going on in the summer. So the use of disproportionate force, it doesn't matter even if one rocket was fired. Okay, let's assume for one moment that a rocket or more than one rocket was fired. That does not entitle the occupying force maintaining its occupation to use disproportionate force such when they know that there is going to be collateral damage. So the answer to that is very clear in international law, and this is what the presenters should be employing. Now there's a final factual point. We asked on a number of occasions witnesses who had familiarity with, and one sitting in the front row right here, about, all right, so they say they're answering rocket, but let's have a look. What hospital was shielding a rocket base, or storing rockets and munitions, or even allowing a mobile motorcyclist to park in the hospital car park that might be firing? None. There is absolutely no evidence that hospitals, which have been, and we put the figures in here, these are significant proportions when you're dealing with extermination, a phrase which needs to be looked at very carefully, and we put the definition in here. You're not only killing and maiming and injuring, you're not permitting the same population to recover. So it's not about rockets when you begin to look beyond. Schools. Schools occupied the United Nations as refugees. They're not a base for rockets. And actually, I'm going to summarise it. There's not a single shred of evidence that any rocket so-called base was being shielded by any of these institutions, right the way through to industries, cows, farms, and all the rest of it. As one person said, and he had enough humour in him to say, a victim of this, well, my cows weren't members of Hamas, so I don't understand this whole situation of my farm annihilated and I have no means of reparation, there's no compensation, because they're an enemy state. Well, they're not an enemy state, they're a hostile enemy, and so compensation is not due. So, again, a long answer, but we have dealt with it in that way. So those are the paragraphs that cover it. Thanks.
So, before that, we close